What I wanted to do was to start by explaining socialism and capitalism as I understand them and why I prefer capitalism to socialism. And I start with what economists call the coordination problem, which is a problem that all societies face. Producing anything substantial, even as something as simple as a pencil, ultimately requires the cooperation of hundreds of thousands or millions of people. If you trace through everybody involved, that to have a pencil, you need wood. To have wood, you need chainsaws. To have chainsaws, you need steel and gasoline and a variety of other things. And somebody's got to grow the trees, and that involves a bunch of people. And if you trace back the causal links, even for a pencil, and more obviously for an automobile, you realize that somehow, by some magical process, a very large number of people are coordinating their activity to make sure that if someone wants to build cars, because someone wants to drive cars, someone produces enough steel, which means someone has to produce enough iron ore and enough coal, and run down the link. And your first instinct looking at that problem is we must all be dead, because how could you possibly coordinate that many people in order to make the society work? And there are basically two answers to that problem, with many variants of both, of course. The obvious answer is hierarchy. The obvious answer is that you have someone who figures out what everybody should do and makes them do it. And that system works tolerably well for small groups of people, but it doesn't scale very well. That as you increase the size of the hierarchy, the distance between the CEO and the factory floor gets more and more layers of people, and it's harder for him to tell what people are doing or what they ought to be doing. The other and non-obvious solution, which is the one that does scale, is decentralized coordination under a system of more or less private property and voluntary trade. And again, there are lots of variants in detail on how it works. Different societies, different things are categorized as private properties. Some things are commons, the air, for example, or the English language, which we don't have intellectual property rights to. But for the most part, you've got a pattern of decentralized coordination. And it's a little puzzling at first how it works. And the full explanation generally takes about a semester or two of price theory course. I could point people to one of my books that's intended as a substitute for that course. But the basic logic is pretty simple. Individuals are making decisions. They're deciding how much iron ore to dig, how many books to write, whatever they're doing. And we want a system where when I make a decision, the decision it is in my interest to make is reasonably close to the decision it's in our interest to make. And how do you do it? You have a system where the individual who's making a decision bears the costs of that decision, receives the benefits of that decision. Hence, if benefits are larger than cost, it will be to his interest to make the decision. If not, he won't. That's the basic logic of decentralized coordination. And the way it works in a market society is that if I want to produce something, I need inputs. If I am a freelance author, among other things, so I need a cover, which requires an artist. So I've got to make a deal with the artist. I need various other inputs for what I'm doing. If I'm making a car, I need steel. For all of those inputs on the market system, I've got to pay somebody else enough or offer him something else he values enough so that he's willing to do it. So that means that the cost to the worker of spending his time making my cover or spending his time mining iron ore or whatever he is doing has to be compensated in what I pay him. And therefore that cost is transferred to me. When I produce something of value, whether a book or a car, the purchaser is then giving me a price which reflects the value to him of that something. So I'm receiving the benefit. So I'm receiving the benefit, paying the cost. Hence, if benefit is larger than cost, it's in my interest to do it. That's the basic logic of the system at the very simplified level. And there are lots of complications. In particular, there are a set of problems that economists describe as market failure, which are cases where for one reason or another, someone who makes a decision either can't collect the benefit of it, makes a radio broadcast, for example, and can't control who gets it, or some doesn't have to bear the costs or all of the costs. For example, air pollution is a sort of standard example, or had my neighbors who have loud parties late at night and don't worry whether or not it's keeping me up. So it's not a perfect system. We don't have any perfect systems. but it nonetheless is a way of getting decentralized coordination where, to at least first approximation, everybody makes the right decision. And unfortunately, as far as I know, there is no better alternative. Why is capitalism better? And ultimately, the answer is that hierarchy doesn't scale, that hierarchy works for a family firm, it works for a football team more or less, but it doesn't work very well for a national economy. And in theory, in the capitalist system, you have hierarchical system only up to the size where it keeps working, as judged by what people are willing to accept as payments for their inputs and what they're willing to pay for its outputs. In a socialist system, the hierarchy is not disciplined in that way. And people who support a socialist system mostly assume that it will be disciplined instead by political mechanisms, by democracy in some societies, by a wise, benevolent dictator, which some optimists at various times in history have believed in, but by some political mechanism or other. And the problem is, I was talking earlier about market failure. Market failure happens when individuals make decisions where they're not bearing most of the cost or receiving most of the benefits. That is the exception on the market system, although it occurs. It is the normal pattern in the political system. There is no political actor who is either receiving all of the benefits of his actions or paying a significant part of the cost. That if you think of the bottom level of democracy, which is the individual voter, if you cleverly, wisely study all issues and vote for the best guy, first, it'll probably have no effect because you're only one voter out of 100 million or so. But if it has an effect, the benefit is shared with the rest of the population of the country, you're getting almost none of it. If you are a judge and you make the wrong decision, the costs go to somebody else. If you set a bad precedent, which could have enormous costs over a long period of time, you never find out and the costs go to other people. If you are a politician and you pass a tariff, the benefits of the tariff go to the industry that's protected. The costs of the tariff go to people who are buying its products at a higher price, and exporters who can't export as much because we're not importing as much. All of those are being imposed on other people. So we don't have any method, at least I don't know of any method. I don't think we've discovered any method by which you can use political mechanisms to get people to make the right decision. And almost always people who are arguing over doing something politically simply assume their conclusion. They say, let us have a government which does X. And what I want to do is to impose on the government, when we're thinking about it, exactly the same constraints I impose on the market. To say under what circumstances will political actors make the right decision or the wrong decision. And unless you've got a good reason to expect them to make the right decision, you have no business assuming that they will. So that's the problem with all of the proposals to use political action to fix the flaws of the market, which certainly exist, and that they simply take it for granted that the government actor who intervenes will intervene for the general good rather than in order to get reelected, or in order to get bribes, or in order to promote those people he likes and not the people he doesn't like, or whatever. I thought I would end by giving a quote on just how well capitalism works from a source that Professor Wolff may be familiar with. It's a description of the very early stages of capitalism. And the quote goes as follows. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces that have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? That was written by Karl Marx in 1848, very early in the history of modern capitalism. We've gone further since then. In 1800, about 80% of the world lived in what we now define as extreme poverty, less than about $1.90 a day income. By 2016, it was down to 10%. That was not the result of socialism. It was the result, in large part, in the last stages of it, of China abandoning socialism, of India stopping to depend on 5-year plans and switching to something at least a little closer to capitalism, a set of changes in which the basic market structure, often impeded by governments in lots of ways, spread around the world.